Kia ora koutou katoa, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for the introduction. I thank you to the Financial Services Council for the opportunity to speak to you today. Let me acknowledge Acting Chief Executive Hayley Stroud and Independent Chair Rob Flanagan. And I'd also like to acknowledge some of the other guests in attendance: FMA CEO Samantha Barris, Deputy Reserve Bank Governor Christian Hawkesby, and Retirement Commissioner Jane Wrightson. Collectively, those in this room today play a huge role in New Zealanders' lives, whether it be providing insurance services, looking after people's savings, helping them prepare for retirement, or fending off the attention of scammers. And you are on the front line of many of the big issues confronting New Zealanders today, including climate change, competition policy, and growing our economy to support improving incomes and living standards. As a country, there is no doubt we face some big challenges and opportunities in the coming years. How do we improve competition between the big players in the New Zealand economy? How, in an ever more electricity-hungry world, do we ensure our people and industry have access to abundant, affordable, renewable energy? How, in an era of growing digitisation, do we ensure we catch the productivity wave made possible by AI while also protecting people from increasingly sophisticated scammers? How should we apportion the cost of climate adaptation and mitigation? How do we ensure people factor climate change into their decision-making, whether it's about where to build, what sort of activity to invest in, or what mode of transport to use? And for those of you who take an interest in government, it won't come as any surprise to hear that ours is not a government that thinks it has all the answers to these important questions. We recognise that many of you in the audience have expertise and knowledge that can contribute to the way New Zealand approaches these issues, and we want to tap into that. We see our role as ministers as shaping sensible policies that create a strong foundation for a growing and resilient economy, that deliver good living standards, choices and opportunities for New Zealanders, and that enable sound decision-making by communities, firms, families and individuals. So before I talk in more detail about the government's work programme, let me give you a brief update on how we view the fiscal and economic outlook. As you're aware, the incoming government inherited elevated levels of debt, a structural deficit, decades-high inflation, and an economy severely strained by a rapid rise in interest rates. Against that backdrop, we have acted swiftly. A sustained period of high inflation had eroded the value of New Zealanders' earnings and savings, discouraged investment, and put financial pressure on families and businesses. And so, Budget 2024 put the government's books on a credible path back to fiscal sustainability. The Crown accounts are now forecast to return to surplus in 2028, and net core Crown debt is forecast to start trending down as a percentage of GDP the same year. Inflation is falling, and the bank's decision last month to lower the official cash rate for the first time since March 2020 shows it is confident that inflation is under control, and the era of extreme price increases is now over. Now, none of this means, of course, that the economic clouds that have been hovering over New Zealand have magically cleared, and I'm well aware that many businesses and families are still doing it tough. However, the easing of interest rates and the government's commitment to living within its means should give you the confidence you need to invest, hire, and start growing again. The soaring of business confidence last month to its highest level in more than a decade suggests many of you have already taken heed of that message. As a government, we will continue to do our bit, and by any reasonable measure, the May budget was tight, with the operating allowance, the amount set aside for new discretionary spending, limited to $3.2 billion. That compares to average operating allowances of $4.1 billion over the previous 6 years. It's also worth noting that Budget 2024 featured savings of $23 billion over the 4-year forecast period, with more than 240 individual savings initiatives. That shows what's possible when you pay close attention to the bottom line. The operating allowances set for budgets 25 through to 2027 are tighter still at $2.4 billion, and operating within these allowances will be challenging, but the government is committed to doing so because restoring the balance between government revenue and spending is essential to putting New Zealand on a sounder economic and fiscal footing. And we know that that task will be made immeasurably easier if we create the conditions for a faster growing, more prosperous economy. And that task is front of mind for us in all that we do. Our coalition government is resolutely pro-growth, pro-development, and anti-red tape. We're focused on the big enablers and the big barriers that we can shift to make New Zealand a better place to live and do business. Our goal is to grow the economy by increasing productivity across the board and supercharging New Zealand's export potential by developing more trade and easier investment opportunities. To enable this, we are driving reforms across 5 key areas of activity: infrastructure, education, overseas connections, investment and trade, innovation, and regulation. And I want to spend a little time on the last of these today, that somewhat dry subject of regulation. Our focus on regulation is twofold. On the one hand, it's about reducing the reach and complexity of regulation that creates barriers to investment, innovation, and growth. You've seen, for example, our work to ensure that the regulation for the financial services sector is fit for purpose. We've been concerned that well-intended but often overlapping layers of new regulation have become cluttered and confusing for participants, leading to suboptimal outcomes. Our work here, driven by Commerce and Consumer Affairs Minister Andrew Bailey, has focused on providing simplicity, clarity, and including through reforms to the Triple CFA, COFI, the Insurance Contracts Bill, and an ongoing work program which he will detail further in his remarks to you later tonight. The second area of our focus in regulation is about ensuring that regulation is adapted to better meet emerging economic challenges. And so let me highlight 3 areas of particular importance for your industries: climate adaptation, competition, and scams. So first, when it comes to climate adaptation, I think we're all very aware that the severe storms that battered the top half of the North Island at the January and February last year highlighted New Zealand's vulnerability to climate change. Where people build and what they build is going to become increasingly important and is a subject on which I know those of you who work in the insurance industry are thinking deeply about. From the government's point of view, we don't want to get in the way of market signals, but we do want to ensure people have access to all the relevant information when making decisions. Accordingly, my colleague Chris Bishop has announced he will issue a national direction to councils next year as the Minister responsible for Resource Management Act reform. That direction will set out how councils should identify potential natural hazards, assess the risk they pose, and respond to that risk through planning controls. The direction will include requirements to identify and map natural hazards. This will improve council data and transparency and allow people to know where hazards are. I know that this is work that the insurance industry has called for some time, and we agree with you. It's very important. In the meantime, it's worth noting that councils hold statutory powers that they can use to manage risks from natural hazards and ensure they are considered in planning and resource consent processes. I want to turn now to competition policy. And as a backdrop to this, I think it's worth highlighting that the OECD, in its most recent survey of I've just seen that I have Parliament behind me, and yet there's no one barracking at me, so it's really quite a false impression. Well, it's worth highlighting that the OECD, in its most recent survey of the New Zealand economy, stressed that due to our small size, the need to maintain competition is particularly important to help lift our levels of productivity. And in fact, they identified this as an area where attention to regulation is particularly important. And we know that international experience shows that competition is one of the most important drivers of long-term growth and productivity. And you'll have seen from the government's response last month to the Commerce Commission's final report into banking services that the coalition government is serious about ensuring consumers get a fair deal from the big players in the New Zealand economy. The Commission's conclusions were unequivocal. New Zealand's banking sector is uncompetitive and Kiwis are not being well served by a two-tier oligopoly. The big four banks are highly profitable compared to their international peers. They lack innovation and do not aggressively compete for customers. Instead, competition between them resembles a cosy pillow fight, with profit margins coming first and customers second. It's quite the image, isn't it? And that means New Zealand bank customers are getting a raw deal. They face higher prices, fewer choices and poorer service, even when compared to customers of the same parent banks in Australia. And that's not good enough. Among the Commission's 14 recommendations is a recommendation that the government consider what is required to make Kiwibank a disruptive competitor, including how to provide it with more access to capital. Ministers share the Commerce Commission's vision for a stronger, more disruptive Kiwibank, and we want it to have the growth capital it needs to become a maverick that exerts real competitive pressure on the Big Four. Therefore, I've asked Treasury to engage with Kiwibank's parent company on options for raising new capital, including from KiwiSaver funds, New Zealand investment funds, and everyday New Zealanders. And I will take proposals to Cabinet no later than December this year. I also intend to issue a new financial policy remit for the Reserve Bank this year. This will make it clear to the Reserve Bank that the government expects its policies and actions to put greater emphasis on not only maintaining competition, but growing competition. The government is also looking at competition in other areas, such as the supermarket and electricity sectors. We have introduced legislation to the House to enable greater access to and sharing of customer and product data between businesses. And the customer and product data bill that we've recently introduced will give customers greater control over their data, make it easier for them to switch providers for services such as banking, electricity, and telecommunications. It will enable innovation and the introduction of new products and services, and it will facilitate competition by creating opportunities for new players to enter markets. I want to finish just with a few remarks on scammers. Digitisation is transforming the way that we live and work, and I doubt there are many, if any, in this room who still use a chequebook, regularly set foot in a bank, or even do all of their shopping in the real world rather than online. But with this increased convenience comes increased risk. Scams, as you know, are becoming incredibly sophisticated and are causing significant financial loss and emotional harm. Altogether, nearly $200 million was lost to scams last year. And my colleague Andrew Bailey, the Minister I referred to earlier, wrote to the banking sector earlier this year urging stronger action to protect customers. And we are expecting an update on progress shortly. We are willing to work with the sector to ensure better protection for consumers here, more rapid response and more joined up activity. Andrew also travelled to Singapore in June for meetings with Singaporean and Australian ministers about international trends and insights. Anti-scam technology, which has advanced considerably and which by some measures New Zealand is behind the 8 ball on, and regulatory approaches to discussing scams. Safe financial institutions are essential to a prosperous modern economy, and we are paying careful attention to this area because we know that if New Zealanders can't have trust in their financial institutions, that is incredibly undermining to our prospects. In closing, let me say this is a government with a busy work agenda. There's a lot of things I haven't covered off today, and it is early days and we do have a lot more to do. But I hope that, like you, you can feel optimistic that there are brighter days ahead of New Zealand. We are a country with incredible growth potential. We are really well placed to meet global challenges. We see particular opportunity to tune up our policy and legislative settings to set free innovation and growth. And we are determined to move at pace to position us for a more prosperous future. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Are there any particular sectors in our economy that give you cause for concern right now?
Well, look, when I look across the economy, as I say, I am concerned about the lack of competition in banking. That does concern me because that affects every New Zealander who has access to financial services. And it can then affect the productivity of other sectors because who banks choose to lend to and at what rate has a material effect on business growth. Whether you're a small business trying to access capital, a farm trying to expand, it matters. And so we have to get it right. And I think it's telling that the OECD has highlighted that as an area for focus and that the Commerce Commission's report, which I'd encourage you to read, which went through iteration, is really so conclusive that this is an area where we need to act.
Having been in the job for almost a year now, are you at all moved on arguments to expand New Zealand's tax base?
Not at this stage, because I've always said there's 2 things we must do before we raid people's bank accounts again. The first is be able to look everyone in the eye and say, we are spending your money as wisely as possible and extracting maximum value from the investments we already make. I can't honestly say that yet. I'm not satisfied that we are driving maximum productivity from every dollar of tax we take. And the second reason is that I genuinely believe that the best way to afford us the ability to invest in better health and education services in the future is to grow our economy faster. And that needs to be our focus rather than stripping people's pockets straight away.
Okay, I'll get onto that point in just a moment. Looking ahead to the 2025 budget, you've forecast a $2.4 billion operating allowance, so new spending. I think you intimated in Parliament a couple of weeks ago that there's only about $1 billion of that hasn't been committed so far.
600 million.
Are you going to hit that target?
Yes, we will. And that's because we've instigated a new day-to-day discipline, which is, if you think about a household or a business, they don't, when they set their budget, just think about the incremental spend at the top of the iceberg. They always are looking at the layers underneath. Where have we been spending historically? Where should we tune up? Where should we shape up? Governments aren't very good at doing that. They focus just on the incremental spend. We believe we should be looking at all of the spend that's built up over multiple budgets to see whether it still makes sense and drive more value from that. We've got a big program of review across government, and I'm very confident we will find further savings.
It occurs to me that perhaps no stat says more about New Zealand today than the fact that in the 12 months to the end of March, more New Zealanders left than ever before in recorded history. I think net migration was at about 1,000 New Zealand citizens a week. How can we both attract New Zealanders who've moved overseas back to our shores and stem the tide?
Well, look, this is fundamentally one of the issues that caused me to run for Parliament. I care about it deeply. We have 4 children, and I like the idea that some of them, at least some of them, will choose to live out their aspirations in New Zealand. And the truth is, unless we can show young New Zealanders that this is a place you can pursue your ambition, whatever that is, where you'll have good choices, good opportunities, good services, then this is a mobile world and they can leave. And we know, if we look at recent times, that people choosing to leave does correlate with periods where our economy has been underperforming. I don't think there's any argument there. Our economy has been underperforming. So really it just makes me more resolute in the task, Jack, which is we have to deal with the fundamentals of growth if we're going to make sure that people choose to be here, choose to return here. And my view is, actually, there's every reason why that can be possible. We are a country with abundant natural resources, incredible food supply, we're safe with strong institutions, smart people. Yes, we've got to tune up our policies, but ultimately, I'd rather be a New Zealander than any other nationality in the world.
I've got a Kiwi mate in Australia who moved there after the Canterbury earthquakes. He would love to move home. All of his family's here, right? I was talking to him on the phone a couple of weeks ago. He was doing the numbers, comparing the job market in New Zealand, comparing the job market in Australia. He felt relatively confident he would get a role here. But when it came down to it, he said, you know what? I get superannuation at 12%, matched to 12%. Compare that to New Zealand. It means a fundamentally different retirement awaits me in Australia than does in New Zealand. How can KiwiSaver and our superannuation platform be improved?
Well, I think when people look at the choice between Australia and New Zealand, there are a number of factors they'll consider. Number one is probably their wage level, and that is actually the underlying challenge for New Zealand. If we want people to be able to afford to save more, they've actually got to earn more. And depending on the measurement you use, our incomes are between 25 and 30% less on average than Australian incomes. That directly affects people's abilities to save. So my focus is let's get the cost of living under control so that people have more disposable income. That means stable, low inflation. That means getting interest rates down. Let's ensure we're growing incomes through a growing economy. And yes, let's make sure that we've got sensible settings for superannuation, through the super fund, through KiwiSaver. But I don't believe that the main reason people leave is for Australia's super scheme.
Do you think those settings are appropriate?
Look, yes, I think we should always be open to views about how they can be tweaked, how they can be improved, where the balance lies. As a government, we're open to that. I've always been frank that it hasn't been the number one program of reform for our agenda. It's not something that any of the three parties in the coalition campaigned on. It's pretty important to us in terms of maintaining trust that we get on and deliver the things we campaigned on as a priority. But we want to keep engaging with those in the industry and the sector about how we can ensure our savings schemes are fit for the future.
Is it under active consideration?
There's always the ability to consider. I mean, I'm always actively considering the conversations I have with people. Yeah.
At the same time as unemployment is set to rise and many people are losing their jobs through no fault of their own, your government has changed the indexing of benefits so that people receive less money than they would have over the long term under the previous indexing regime. We're now on track.
That depends whether you believe that average wages would have risen faster or not. But okay, I'll see where the question goes.
We're now on track to miss some of our child poverty targets, and we know that poverty has a huge impact on productivity and broader economic growth across the economy. So what is the risk that your government's policies unnecessarily push more families into poverty?
The number one pathway for people to get out of poverty, and I truly believe this and our government believes this, is to provide them ways to get into sustainable work. And actually, the great failing that New Zealand has had in recent years is that we have allowed too many people, particularly young people, who are able to work and in many cases want to work, to linger on a benefit for long periods of time. And what we know is that if you spend more than a year on a benefit, it gets increasingly hard to then enter the workforce. So our focus is very much on how can we work with those who are on a benefit to provide them both access to employment and education opportunities, but also the incentives to get back into the workforce. We truly believe that that's a path. But the other area that I'm very focused on is this concept of social investment. which is about recognising that there are parts of our community who systemically over many generations sometimes have missed out on the opportunities of education and of advancement. And we do make some good investments. But we're pretty haphazard generally about how we do that. Some things work, some things don't work. If we're able to harness the best efforts in communities for those organisations who can really drive change for those families, then actually change will come from them, and that is more lasting than any particular government policy.
Some great questions from the floor. Is competition across the insurance sector being considered through a similar lens as to competition in the banking sector?
Well, obviously there hasn't been a market study, there hasn't been a set of recommendations or a robust analysis the way there has been in the banking sector. I think it's something we should always keep an eye on.
To support Kiwibank's size and scale, would you consider moving more government banking contracts from Westpac to Kiwibank in the future?
Yeah, well, the contract doesn't come up, I think, until 2027, so that's not on our immediate agenda. As I understand it, in the past, the question for Kiwibank was whether or not that was the area of banking service that it felt both expert in or that it wanted to grow its services in. And historically, that hasn't been a contract that they've seen as their key priority. Their focus has been on business lending and on home lending and other day-to-day customer banking services rather than the institutional banking that the government bank contract involves. But look, competitive tenders for any government contract are critically important and things could evolve by 2027.
What about loosening the regulations on other banks smaller than Kiwibank to help improve competition?
Yeah, well, obviously, prudential regulation sits formally with the Reserve Bank, and I've signalled that I want them to be thinking a lot more about competition and the way they form that prudential regulation. That's why I'm revisiting the financial policy remit. And I noted the recommendations of the Commerce Commission around one, who can use the term bank. I'd love to see that liberalised because I think there are entities that are providing what are banking services and they should be able to pitch their services to customers accordingly. But also the capital requirements. You know, when you've got these innovative, clever financial startups who are doing cool things and then they're told you need to have 30 million of capital just sitting in an account untouchable, that's a major barrier to entry.
Is there risk in loosening some of those regulations?
Yes, there is. And that's exactly why we have the Reserve Bank there to manage that financial stability remit. And so I acknowledge there is always a balance between the two things. Yes to competition, but always within the bounds of financial stability. My contention is that the balance has gone too far towards financial stability at the expense of competition and therefore innovative services for consumers.
Another question on poverty. We're still in a cost of living crisis. This person says that in their view, the government seems to have cut funding to many social services. Will there be something meaningful in Budget 2025 to help those social services?
Well, look, we were really careful in our savings exercise actually to acknowledge that we will continue to need frontline services, particularly for those who are vulnerable. We increased funding for health significantly, we've increased funding for education, and we ensured that MSD and others continued to have funding for their services. But there will never be enough money that every service will be delivered exactly as people will want it. Nor can we argue that it will be simply dollars that will make the difference. I'm really focused on the experience that an NGO or social service provider has when they engage with government, because what they tell me is that we are really hard to work with. We are bureaucratic, we're administratively complex, we lay a lot of cost on them. In fact, I spoke with one social service provider recently who says across their various different arms they have 52 contracts with government, and they think they spend 20% of their time administering those contracts and complying with them. What they want to do is focus on the people they serve. So we're focused on how can we improve both procurement and contracting with service providers so they can get on and focus on the outcomes for the vulnerable people they work with rather than ticking boxes for a government department.
I think you're forecasting a return to surplus in 2028. This questioner asked, does Minister Willis accept that tax changes for landlords have delayed the forecast surplus?
No, I don't, because we were always really clear that our tax package needed to be fiscally neutral. That is, that every dollar of tax reduction that we delivered, including restoring interest deductibility for rental properties, would be paid for by savings that we explicitly campaigned on. And we delivered it. We delivered it exactly as we said we would. I look at what we were told would be impossible before the election, and what we actually delivered was almost item by item in terms of the 8 major things that we said would fund tax reduction were almost exactly bang on. We've seen all of those who said, oh, well, it's going to drive up inflation. Well, inflation's come down faster than many were forecasting. We had all those who said it will lead to interest rate hikes. Well, interest rates have been reduced faster. We delivered what we said we would.
Finally, Minister, when do you think we will see a meaningful improvement in sentiment across our economy? When are things not going to feel so blah?
Yeah, well, I was heartened by the ANZ Business Confidence Survey last week, that 23-point jump. Who knows whether it stays there, but what it does tell me is that people can see the path out. 2/3 of the respondents on that survey answered before the OCR had officially been cut, so it wasn't simply a reaction to the Reserve Bank's decision. Increasingly, the conversations I'm having around the country, people acknowledge it is tough, but they believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. The path out of the tunnel is increasingly clear. And I think we now have a job to talk each other out of the funk, to stop having the conversations about all of the things that challenge us and start thinking about all of the opportunities that lie ahead of us. That's our job, and for these next few months, I'm going to try and be our cheerleader in chief.
Well, we know there are epic demands on your time, to say the least, so we very much appreciate you being here this morning. Please join me in thanking Finance Minister Nicola Willis.
Thank you, Jack.